Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that every charging station you've ever seen is about to become as outdated as a floppy disk. Sounds crazy, right? But what if I told you that somewhere on this planet, a vehicle is running right now that's never been plugged in, never visited a gas pump, and shows absolutely no signs of stopping? Yeah, this is real. And it's happening in the last place the tech world expected. So here's the thing. We've all accepted that electric vehicles need charging stations. We've watched billions get poured into building these massive networks across continents. Governments are betting their entire energy strategies on this infrastructure. But there's a problem with that plan, and it's rolling off an assembly line right now, powered by something that shouldn't even be possible, according to everything we thought we knew about energy. Let me take you back to where this all started. In a workshop that most Silicon Valley executives couldn't find on a map, an inventor named Maxwell Chikumbutso was tinkering with an idea that would make every automotive engineer in the world question their entire career. He wasn't trying to build a better battery. He wasn't chasing some incremental improvement in charging speed. No, this guy decided to ask a completely different question. What if cars didn't need external power at all? Now, when word first leaked out about what he'd created, the reaction was exactly what you'd expect. Laughter, dismissal, the usual, yeah, sure, and I've got a perpetual motion machine in my garage type responses. Because we've all heard these claims before, right? Free energy, unlimited power, revolutionary breakthroughs that turn out to be nothing but smoke and mirrors. So when Maxwell rolled out his prototype, nobody was holding their breath. But then something weird started happening. Independent engineers, not people on his payroll, actual skeptics who showed up ready to debunk the whole thing, they drove this vehicle, and they kept driving it. Days turned into weeks. They pushed it through every condition you can imagine: city streets, rough terrain, highway speeds, and here's the kicker: the power never dropped, not even a little. These engineers, some of whom had spent decades in the automotive industry, started walking away from those test drives looking like they'd just seen a magic trick they couldn't explain. Think about what that means for a second. Right now, the entire electric vehicle revolution is built on one fundamental assumption. These cars need to plug in somewhere. Companies have spent fortunes building charging networks. Governments have written entire policy frameworks around charging infrastructure. Homeowners are installing special outlets in their garages. And suddenly there's this vehicle cruising around that makes all of that completely unnecessary. The shock waves started spreading fast. Tech journalists in Silicon Valley started making phone calls. Executives in Beijing went into emergency meetings. European energy ministers started asking very uncomfortable questions about the billions they'd already committed to charging networks. Because if this technology is legitimate, and I mean truly scalable and reliable, then we're not talking about a disruption. We're talking about an extinction-level event for an entire industry that hasn't even fully matured yet. And you know who got really quiet when this news started circulating? The people who built their entire empires on charging infrastructure. Because imagine you've spent years and billions of dollars positioning yourself as the leader in EV charging, only to wake up one morning and realize that charging itself might be about to become obsolete. That's not a competitive threat. That's an existential crisis. So naturally, the skeptics came out in force. They demanded proof. They wanted controlled tests, long-term data, verification from independent sources. Fair enough, right? Anyone can make claims. Show us the receipts. And that's exactly what happened next. Maxwell agreed to something that would make most inventors break out in a cold sweat. A 30-day continuous test. No stops, no hidden charging sessions. Just the vehicle running non-stop under observation by international engineers who were actively looking for any sign of deception. Day 1 passed, then day 5, then day 15. The engineers kept checking, kept monitoring, kept waiting for the moment when the facade would crack and they'd discover the hidden power source. But that moment never came. 30 days straight, and the vehicle just kept going like it had tapped into some invisible reservoir of energy that nobody else knew existed. When those 30 days ended, some of these engineers, hardcore skeptics who'd arrived ready to expose a fraud, actually went on record saying this changed everything they thought they understood about energy systems. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Word about these tests couldn't stay contained. Whispers started circulating through the tech world. Intelligence agencies started paying attention. Major automotive corporations began quietly dispatching teams to investigate. And the media, well, they couldn't decide whether they'd just stumbled onto the story of the century or the most elaborate hoax in automotive history. But the people who were really paying attention, the ones who understood what was at stake, they weren't laughing anymore. Oil executives started convening urgent strategy sessions. Because if vehicles can generate their own power indefinitely, what happens to fuel demand? Investment firms began reassessing their positions in charging infrastructure companies. Policymakers started sweating over the billions they'd already committed to building out charging networks that might be obsolete before they're even completed. And then Maxwell dropped another bombshell. He wasn't content with just proving the concept with a single vehicle. He announced plans to build an entire production facility, a factory specifically designed to manufacture these self-powered vehicles at scale. Most people thought he was getting ahead of himself, but Maxwell had a different vision. He invited observers from around the world to witness the first production run. When those factory doors opened, engineers from multiple continents stood there watching vehicle after vehicle roll off the line. No charging ports, no fuel tanks, just sleek, functional machines that somehow powered themselves. One by one, they were test-driven away from the facility, and every single one performed exactly as promised. The silence among the observers was deafening, because in that moment, everyone in that room understood they were watching the automotive industry's assumptions crumble in real time. The next morning, global headlines exploded. Financial markets started reacting. Policymakers began emergency consultations. Energy companies found themselves answering very difficult questions from their shareholders. And somewhere in all this chaos, Maxwell gave an interview that cut straight to the heart of everything. He looked directly at the camera and said this technology isn't about any one country or corporation. It's about fundamentally changing who controls access to energy. That statement sent another shockwave through the industry. Because he wasn't just talking about cars anymore. He was talking about power dynamics, about resource control, about whether energy would remain something that ordinary people had to constantly pay for, or whether it could become something genuinely accessible. And that message resonated far beyond just automotive circles. Of course, not everyone was thrilled about this development. Strange things started happening around the facility. Security cameras caught suspicious figures attempting to infiltrate the premises. When they were intercepted, the equipment they were carrying turned out to be sophisticated surveillance technology, the kind that's not exactly available at your local electronics store. This wasn't random crime. This was coordinated, professional, and clearly backed by serious resources. Suddenly, the stakes became crystal clear. This wasn't just about building a better car. This was about who would control the next generation of energy technology. And there were powerful entities out there who had invested far too much in the current system to let it be disrupted without a fight. Cyber attacks targeted the facility's systems. Supply shipments mysteriously went missing. Engineers reported being followed. The message was obvious. This technology had become a threat to some very established interests. But here's what made this story really fascinating. Instead of backing down or selling out to the highest bidder, Maxwell doubled down. He announced the ultimate challenge, a 100-day continuous endurance test, fully transparent, open to any observer who wanted to verify the results. Skeptics said it was impossible. Critics claimed he was bluffing. But day after day, week after week, those vehicles kept running without interruption. By the time that 100th day arrived, something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't speculation anymore. This wasn't hype or exaggeration. The data was irrefutable. These vehicles could genuinely operate indefinitely without external power sources. And that meant every assumption underpinning the current transportation and energy infrastructure needed to be completely rethought. Even the biggest names in the industry had to acknowledge what was happening. Public statements started shifting from dismissal to grudging acknowledgement to actual interest in collaboration. Because at a certain point, denying reality becomes more expensive than adapting to it. The question was no longer whether this technology worked. The question was what would happen next. And Maxwell, to his credit, made a decision that stunned the entire business world. Instead of patenting the technology in a way that would let him or any single corporation monopolize it, he released it under an open innovation license. He essentially said this belongs to humanity, not to whoever can afford the most lawyers. That move alone might end up being more revolutionary than the technology itself. Because here's what we're really witnessing. This isn't just about replacing charging stations or reducing emissions or saving money on fuel. This is about a fundamental shift in how energy works in our society. For generations, we've accepted that energy is something you have to constantly purchase from someone else. You go to the gas station, you plug into the grid, you pay your bills. That's just how it works, right? But what if it doesn't have to work that way? What if vehicles and maybe eventually homes and entire communities could generate their own power continuously? What does that do to energy markets? What does it do to geopolitics? What does it do to the massive corporations that have built their empires on controlling energy distribution? Those aren't small questions. Those are the questions that reshape civilizations. Now look, I know what some of you are thinking. This sounds too good to be true. And historically, yeah. Claims about revolutionary energy breakthroughs usually don't pan out. But here's the difference. This isn't just theoretical. It's not just calculations on paper or promising lab results. These vehicles exist. They've been driven. They've been tested by independent observers who had every reason to be skeptical. The evidence isn't perfect, but it's substantial enough that major players in the global economy are taking it seriously. So where does this leave us? Well, if this technology continues to prove viable at scale, we're looking at one of those rare moments where the trajectory of human civilization actually bends in a new direction. Charging infrastructure investments might need to be completely reconsidered. Oil-dependent economies might need to accelerate their diversification plans. And the entire automotive industry might need to rethink its product roadmaps. But more than that, this represents something we don't see very often. Innovation emerging from a part of the world that's typically been positioned as a consumer rather than a creator of cutting-edge technology. That shift alone, regardless of what happens with this specific invention, signals something important about how global innovation is evolving. Here's the bottom line. Whether this technology completely revolutionizes transportation, or whether it faces obstacles we haven't seen yet, one thing is undeniable. The conversation has permanently changed. We can no longer simply assume that vehicles will always need external charging. We can no longer dismiss the possibility of genuinely self-sustaining power systems. The impossible just became possible, and now we have to deal with the implications. So what do you think? Are we witnessing the beginning of the end for charging stations? Or is there something we're missing in this story? Drop your thoughts in the comments because this conversation is far from over. And if you want to stay updated as this situation develops, because trust me, there's going to be more to this story, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell. This might just be the most important technological shift we'll witness in our lifetimes, and you definitely don't want to miss what happens next.